Hello and welcome to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. This is your host, Greg Payne, coming at you from Studio 12. This podcast is about being the best possible grandpa you can be, focusing on what it is to be a grandpa and how we can all share that experience together for our grandchildren. Good friend of the show, Ted Page, is joining us to talk about his upcoming project, the Good Grandpa book. Now, this is in conjunction with his successful blog, Good Grandpa, where he really goes in and documents all the great things that grandfathers are doing to connect with the rising generation. Now, one of the great things that you're going to hear Ted talk about is that he asked the likes of John Cleese and Tom Brokaw, what's the one thing, the most essential and powerful wisdom you've learned that you want the next generation to know? You are really going to enjoy hearing what those answers are, as well as listening more to what Ted is doing over at goodgrandpa.com. At the end of our conversation, Ted has a really special ask for all of you grandpas out there and all of you who know good grandpas. So I hope you can help him out. Before we get started, I do want to remind you, we still got a couple of weeks before the end of the year, and my children's book, My Grandpa's Grandpa, is on sale for 20% off. So you can go over to cool-grandpa.us and you can easily order that book, and we still got a little bit of time for me to get this thing out to you for the holidays. So I hope you enjoy this conversation with Ted. I always enjoy reading his blogs, and I always enjoy sitting down and talking with him. So without further ado, let's jump into this conversation. Welcome, Ted, to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. I'm excited to have you on to talk about some of the new adventures and activities you've got going on over at Good Grandpa.
Well, thank you, Greg. Really appreciate being on the show again. And it is an adventure. It's a journey. And I think we're all on our own versions of this journey, just having a lot of fun.
Oh, for sure. And you're right. Everybody's got a different kind of journey, different kind of circumstance. But I'd love to jump in a little bit and catch up on what you've been doing over the last year or so.
So, blogging away on, goodgrandpa.com and just trying to meet more grandfathers and, kind of broaden my horizons and more people who are writing in this space, including what I call the grandmasphere. A tremendous number of women, grandmothers who are bloggers and writers. And I had been following a writer who does a column called Generation Grandparent for the New York Times. Her name is Paula Spann. She had written an audiobook that I thought was really good, and I loved her columns. So I reached out to Paula early this year and said, I've really been thinking about the differences between grandmothers and grandfathers. It seems like we play similar roles, but different roles. And my wife and I always talk about how, here we are, baby boomers, and supposedly, we've learned a few things in the course of our lives and perhaps not doing things the same old traditional ways. And yet my wife happened to be the one who makes what I consider the world's best cookies. She makes an oatmeal raisin cookie, which is so good. I eat almost all of them, and I'm guilty of that. I want to just own up to that officially on your podcast. So she's making the cookies, and I'm off doing more man things with for our grandkids. We're playing and making castles out of the couch cushions and doing projects and so forth. So here we have these pretty traditional roles, and maybe just think, is this common? Has this world changed much since our parents' generation? So Paula was very receptive to the idea, and she'd been thinking along the same lines. So she started working on a story, and that was, at least 4 or 5 months in the making. And she had a lot of back and forth with her editor, but she published a piece in March of this year that was in the New York Times digital and print editions called "How to Become a Better Grandfather." And I had right around that time, I had introduced you to Paul as well, and you were in that story,
Right.
Cool Grandpa podcast, because I thought you're just doing some great things with the podcast. And I tell you, they say traditional media is dead, and they're wrong. Like, at least in terms of like the New York Times, it's got a fantastic readership. It's got something like 9 million readers for the digital edition and a ton more people for the print edition. And I saw a 5,000% increase in blog traffic, all kinds of people reaching out to me through the blog, including 2 weeks after that story came out, a literary agent in New York reached out and said, I've written, or I've represented writers for numerous New York Times bestsellers, and I think it's time for a book, on grandfathering. Maybe it's the Good Grandpa book. And I had been kind of stewing on that idea for a little while, and it was just interesting that this agent just happened to reach out when I was thinking about it too. And I said, let's talk. And I think I thought about it for about 30 seconds. And I said, let's do it. So it took a month to write a 50-page book proposal. And then my agent was off to the races. And I was rejected repeatedly. It's part of the game. It's part of the publishing world. I think I was turned down by 20 publishers. And I said to my agent, only tell me about them if there's some kind of substantive feedback, like if they have a criticism. And I never heard a criticism of it. It was just not quite right for us, whatever. But ultimately, a company called Regalo Press, which is a relatively new press, but run by a veteran who's worked with people like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Carolyn Kennedy. She really responded well to it and had a conversation, and so I've signed on with Regalo Press. And one of the things I like about their business model is that they're philanthropic, and so they have a different way of going about things. And when the book comes out, which won't be until beginning of 2025, but they will make a donation to the charity of my choice, which is Children International, which supports health and well-being of children all over the world. So that's, that fits in with my perspective and mission on the blog and the book, is to nurture the next great generation. How do we make it happen? So it's a new chapter, if you will, in kind of the evolution of Good Grandpa. And I'm facing the hard part, which is actually writing something good.
Oh yeah. Yeah, now it comes time to do the interviews and get all the material and everything together.
Yeah, it's proving to be challenging and fascinating at the same time, because a big thrust in the book is to harvest and share the most important wisdom from the world's grandfathers in different cultures and countries. And one of the questions I ask grandpas when I talk with them is, what is the number one thing? What is the number one piece of wisdom that you feel is really important? Something that it's taken your whole life to figure this out, and for this idea to matter and to see it as so important for young people to know about. What is that number one thing? And that number one thing, by the way, that's kind of an homage to the movie City Slickers with Billy Crystal. The Jack Palance character, the old cowboy, who says, "What's the number one thing?" It's not all the other stuff. It's what's the number one thing. So I've just started the process, but I've been fortunate to be connected to Tom Brokaw, legendary newscaster. He is featured in the blog. And so there's an interview with him that was just published this week, including his number one thing, which I thought was interesting. And then I happen to have a working relationship with the great John Cleese from Monty Python, who's my total comedy god, who I just got lucky that I could work with him on some projects. And so he had a touring show. I was up in Lowell, Massachusetts this week. So I got together and had a lovely 2-hour lunch with John and reconnected and said, hey, I work on this book. And I'm asking, the old grandpas of the world, including you, John, because he's a grandpa, what's the number one thing? And he said, well, I know what the number one thing is. And he proceeded to tell me in no uncertain terms what the number one piece of wisdom is. So I'm going to be continuing this process and gathering stories. And I'm planning a trip to Cherokee, North Carolina, to visit with the elders of the Cherokee Nation, Eastern Division. I'm planning a trip to Europe, South America, Texas. So I'm not just meeting with Native Americans, but also, the cowboys of the world and American South and Asia and India are all on the list. And I'm fascinated to see where that takes me and open to how the story finds me instead of me finding the story.
Oh, sure. Well, I've got to, before we go any further, I got to ask you, what was the number one thing from Tom Brokaw and John Cleese?
I'm tempted to say you have to read the book, Greg, but I'm gonna since you've been nice enough to have me on your show again, I'm gonna tell you exactly what they said. So Tom Brokaw, it was a written interview with Tom because he has some old age issues going on with hearing and so forth. But he said there's no autopilot in life. You have to earn every move. And I wrote back and I said, I just want to double check that you're saying earn every move and not learn every move. And he wrote back in all caps, said, it's earn every move. And then I asked, what is an example of things in your amazing career as a newsman? I hosted, I think it was NBC Nightly News for over 20 years. He's won a Presidential Medal of Freedom. Like, what's an example of something you had to earn? And I was thinking he would say, well, I got to earn my career. I had to earn the next job. I had to invest. He said, earn the affection of your children. Think about that concept. You have to earn the affection of your children. It's like, that's the thing everyone kind of assumes that you're going to have. And I had read, The Greatest Generation. That's why I reached out to him, because I wanted to know, how do we make our grandkids the greatest generation? And do we need an existential crisis for them to rise to the occasion and become as great as they can be? But from his background, he grew up, from nothing in South Dakota, extremely hardworking family, and everything that they had, they all earned it. And I think he simply, extended that into every aspect of his life. And he was constantly earning everything, not just that next position, not just the new award, but the affection of his family. So I thought that was a really interesting insight. And then John Cleese, this is a man who banged coconuts together as he went across the English countryside in his first major film, Monty Python and the Holy Grail, Life of Brian, incredibly silly things, right? So you'd think maybe he would have said something funny, well, like, what's the number one thing? But he's a scientist at heart. He's a philosopher and a conversationalist. He's an intellectual. He studied law. I think it was in Cambridge before he got into comedy at the Footlights Club.
Mm-hmm.
He said, it's more important to find out the answer than it is to know the answer. And when I pressed him on that, he talked about, Newton developing or discovering certain laws of physics. And then it was hundreds of years. That was just accepted orthodoxy. Everybody knew the answers because they knew the learnings of Newton. And then Einstein comes along with a theory of relativity, and all of a sudden you have quantum mechanics and Niels Bohr, and he's just expounding on all this. As all of these beliefs were considered true, just absolute truth. But it was the finding of what's true that's more important. And being certain can be a problem. We have to go into life with a level of uncertainty and seek out the truth, seek out the answers. And that's where the magic is. So it's interesting, even just with a couple people asking that question, that the answers are so divergent. And part of me thinks I'm going to find certain patterns, right? And then be able to map the different patterns of the answers in different cultures. And maybe one idea will rise to the surface, but it might be just a mosaic of ideas that, but this has never been done, right? This is never, we're the first generation that's had the internet as a way to communicate ideas and share ideas. And, the internet gets a bad rap for a lot of things, but it's great for blogs and podcasts and for, sharing ideas like this. And so I'm excited to see if, what are the answers that come to the surface, and then what is the audience for this? Because right off the bat, I don't think it's necessarily just us grandparents. I think grandparents are certainly an audience, but I think there's an awful lot of young people, parents, who are yearning to understand the wisdom that's gathered through time. And I think they might be the biggest audience, and maybe that's most valuable to them.
And I think you're right on that, especially when you think of just the example of what Tom Brokaw mentioned to you about earning, that affection from the children. I mean, that's a whole chapter or whole way of thinking about parenting and even being a grandparent that maybe hasn't occurred to people before, because I think normally we assume that I'm the parent, the kids need to listen to me. I provide, food, shelter, I should have affection given to me based upon what I'm doing for them, and not earning that emotional connection piece.
Yeah, I think earning the affection and not taking things for granted. And I would extend it out. I can't put words in Tom's mouth, but extend it out to earning some respect. That yes, a certain amount of respect comes with who we are as the elders, right? Grandparents and parents. But we also have to model good behaviors. I remember my son played lacrosse and soccer for most of his middle school and high school years. In his junior year, he decided to play football. And I had played football in middle school, and I had a lot of fun. I said, all right, give it a shot. I think it's a different culture, just so you're aware. It's not the same vibe. Football is very different. And I couldn't really get into it with him. You just had to try it. So one of the first games, a fight broke out in the field between my son's team and the visiting team. And some parents in my town started yelling, fight, fight, fight. Right? Like, it was the opposite of what we'd experienced in other games, in lacrosse and soccer. It's like Parents would never encourage kids to fight. It'd be the absolute opposite. And that was a huge turnoff to my son, as it should be to anybody. It's like, what are they thinking? So that's not modeling, that's not earning respect. That's teaching terrible behavior. So I can see where, Mr. Brokaw is coming from. And maybe what Brokaw and Cleese said, as different as they are, there are similarities, because if you have to earn everything, it also means that you are constantly seeking. You're seeking affection, you're seeking respect. You don't have it automatically. Just like, it's more important to find the answer than to know the answer. You have to constantly be seeking and testing to see if you really know something. So, maybe that's where some of the commonalities will be. But, I'm just really curious, like, what will the Cherokee say? And wouldn't it be interesting if, after talking to someone in rural India and Gloucester, Massachusetts, and Cherokee Nation, and Colombia and South America, and Italy and England, what if something rises to the surface that's never been really discussed? I mean, that's what I hope for.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that is I don't know, the elixir, right? Is, hey, going back to it, what's the one thing that you could tell grandfathers and people about, where it's like, hey, if you focus and you hit this one thing, that's going to help bring everything else into alignment.
Yeah, that would be magic. It might be 100 things, might be 1,000 things. They might all be different. It might be this interesting mosaic of ideas. And I have been asked several times, like, what about the grandmas? You can interview the grandmas, and I'm sure I will along the way. I think, as I've said many times, grandmas have been far more active as grandparents and public and visible and vocal than grandfathers have, I think, for a number of reasons. They're doing a terrific job with it. We have a lot to learn from them and their example. But I happen to be a grandpa, and I think a good grandma book would be terrific. I think it should be a woman who writes it. I think it'd be a lot more authentic from a woman's perspective. But, I think there's always differences between men and women, and I think there's different stories that men can share as part of this. The more the merrier. The more we're all sharing ideas, the better.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that I've got a number of grandmas and moms that listen into the Cool Grandpa podcast, and a lot of what we talk about, and I think a lot of what your book's going to talk about, are those connection points and those things that really transcend the role that we might have, to just, what can I do to build a stronger relationship within the family, or what could I build stronger friendships with even. It's the little things about, hey, what's the interest that your grandchildren have? And build on that. Ask them questions. Get involved with what they're interested in. That's the same thing as having a friendship. What's that friend involved in? What do they like to do? What can you spend time with them doing along the lines of their interest? So I think there's a lot of that crossover, and I think sometimes maybe we get hung up on grandmas, grandpas, moms, dads, and sometimes the similarities are a lot more in volume than the disparity. Nah, the differences.
Yeah. Yeah, I there's certainly far more commonalities than differences. When I think grandmothers are known, I think, for being more nurturing overall. One thing I've written about in the book is that the grandparents I knew the best were on my mother's side, and they lived to be quite old. And my grandmother was this teller of stories, and both my grandparents were tellers of stories. They were different stories. My grandfather had been a pilot in the First World War, and full colonel in the Second World War, had to go back to England and fight. But whenever my grandmother spoke at a family event, she would often read a poem that she had written, or she would just give a speech and she would say, I love my grandchildren. I adore all of my grandchildren. And then she had great grandchildren, and she always was saying how much she loved everyone. My grandfather never said he loved us. It was his, he was the colonel, he was the officer, but he showed that he loved us with all the things that he did with us. So they loved us equally, but my grandmother expressed it more. And I don't know if have you seen that in any of your travels in terms of like expressing love versus showing it, or a combination?
I think so. I think there's part of it too where, in general, I believe that guys have a harder time with readily expressing love and affection. Now, that doesn't mean that in one on one situations, putting an arm around somebody's shoulder or something along those lines and then saying, hey, I really love you. And that doesn't happen frequently. But to your point, I think there's a lot more that comes across in actions, in ways of service, in a lot of the little things that grandpas and fathers can do. And sometimes that's just spending quiet moments with a grandchild. And some of the women that I've interviewed talk about grandfathers that would just sit with them along the stream and fish and not even say much, but it was just that presence and knowing that they had a connection together. It was something that, of course, was very different from making cookies with grandma or sewing or doing something else, where they're much more interactive verbally. But just that presence seems to really come across when I talk to adult, especially women.
Interesting. Interesting. You brought up the sitting by the stream. It brought back experience I had repeatedly with my grandfather by a stream, but it was hauling rocks in the brook. He would he was in his 70s, and he would bring me down to this brook that was on our property in northern Vermont. He'd hand me a 6 foot long crowbar. I think I was probably 6'2" at the time. And he would have me get down the brook and move boulders from the middle of the brook onto the bank to prevent erosion in the spring. And this was like an all day thing. It's like, and he would always say, all right, we're almost done. 10 in the morning, we're almost done. And then 4 in the afternoon, yep, just come move that rock over there. So it wasn't, hey, Teddy, I just love you. I just love you. It's like, we're not quite done here.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I think there's lots of ways of being present, right? So one was fishing, but the other was just really hard work, for long periods of time. I was never put to work by my grandmother. I don't think that, I don't know, that just wasn't the role. I would have, I mean, I was in other ways, but not hauling rocks, I guess.
Oh, sure. Well, and that's why I think too, when you're talking about some of these different cultures and some of these different people, I think we are going to see that mosaic based on circumstances, based on cultural traditions, based on personalities, that at the end of the day, the one thing may be part of that mosaic, and that one thing may strike a chord with somebody that's in a similar situation as the author of that quote or that saying or that piece of wisdom that you're going to end up finding, because so many of us come at these opportunities with different backgrounds, different needs, different challenges. And so I always tell people there's not one way to be a grandpa. It's whatever way that you're, you know, making progress and moving forward in that role and making those connections. That's the way.
I'm curious to that end, and you're saying that people come at it from different experiences, so there's no one way to be a grandpa, or to be a good or a cool grandpa or a grandmother. At the same time, I'm trying to capture, to seek out the perspectives from people who do have those different ways. There's no one way, one of the many ways. And I'm trying to determine at this stage of the book writing and the research, what are the cultures that I should look at? Who should I talk with? What type of backgrounds would provide insight into those different ways of thinking and looking at the world and guiding the children, to be their best version of themselves. Like you've spoken to a lot of grandpas. I mean, what types of cultures do you think are there? Whether it's nationalities or just economic backgrounds. Like, what are the different within this kind of mosaic? Who should I talk with? Do you think?
I think talking with as many different people as you can from different economic backgrounds and in economic backgrounds, even within cultural backgrounds, right? Because somebody that's going to be, and I'm ignorant about all this, but somebody that has means and is pretty well off in India is probably going to have a different experience and a different approach to being a grandfather as somebody that's lower on the socioeconomic scale within the same province, within the same country.
Mm-hmm.
And that's certainly true here because you can see the differences between, how grandfathers act up in Massachusetts versus how do they act and get along in Appalachia and then Texas and then California. And so I think, casting that wide net gives you a great chance at perspective. And the other thing too that's going to be interesting and that have been looking at is that, really grandfathers in numbers haven't been around that long, probably only the last 100 years or so. I had done a course and did some research where the average age of somebody in the US at the turn of the 20th century was, I think, upper 40s, 50 years old was the average.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, now we're into our 70s. But that means that you have a whole group of men that were dying or had died off by the time they were reaching our age and becoming grandfathers. So if you had a grandfather, that was kind of unique. And being a grandfather probably meant that you were higher up on the socioeconomic scale because you had access to health care and food and, probably weren't busted up working in the field or the factory.
Mm-hmm. I think, that's a really good point. That, in human history, grandparents have been pretty rare. I read, I think it was an article in Scientific American. It was about the origins of grandparents in history, and while life expectancy has increased a lot, just in the past 100 years, for most of history, it's been a pretty gradual process. So, but this article was saying it was like 30,000 years ago, like in present day Europe, was when it was just beginning to get, people living just long enough to be around for a little while, the first grandparents. And it was the beginning of shared knowledge between the generations where they could say, yeah, this is the most successful way to plant a seed. And of course, the communities that could plant better seeds that was the beginning of prosperity and better health. And that fed greater longevity. And it happened to be right around the time in human evolution where there was, a birth in language, birth in greater use of tools, and all these other things which spurred greater development for the human race. So the scientists think that these things built off of each other. And here we are in 2023, where so different already from my parents' generation, where my grandfather and my father's died of tuberculosis when my grandfather he was probably in his 30s, and my father was 7 years old. So I didn't have two grandfathers growing up. My 5-year-old granddaughter has 4 grandparents and multiple great grandparents. Like, I think every one of her great grandparents is also still with us. So think about that change. That's not just, hey, we're around for birthday parties and, you know, for those special occasions, but we're there to pass on wisdom and share it with them. Everything like diet and, how to live, when they get older, investment advice, where do you put your money so you get a better return? These are not small things. These are things that help that generation live a better life that our ancestors didn't have the benefit of passing that wisdom on. So, and yeah, the difference in the socioeconomic pieces, but I'm just wondering, and we won't know the answer to this, but with time, does the fact that we're around longer, working on our health, longevity, for the most part, continues to increase? How does our ability to share wisdom improve now versus past generations? And can we do a better job of that so that our grandkids can be that greatest generation?
As you were talking, my mind was going to, we need to start to read better books and even think in terms of philosophy to an extent, because you were talking about the financial literacy and you're talking about some of these deeper things where we're not showing so much how to plant and how to work with tools and how to hunt and how to do those things. But it's, okay, how do you take care of yourself in an information age, in this consumer age? And then how do you make sure that you feel connected to something when so many of us feel isolated? My mind drifts to being able to read good authors and read good thinkers and being able to share what we are learning with those grandchildren, right? And it's not necessarily hammering in maybe one point of view, but it's going, oh, well, these people thought this way and these people thought this way, and have you thought about this? And that can all be done while you're having a car ride somewhere, or that could be all done, however you're going to do it. Raking leaves or pushing rocks up against a creek bed. You can have some discussions about, well, what do you think about this? And it might be a current events, but you start to bring in an idea of philosophy, and you start to bring in an idea in being able to have conversations about a way of life and a way of living. And maybe that's something that grandparents can really dig into with, as you said, we've got YouTube, we've got books on tape or audible, or, and just good books, being able to pass on that information that also helps us understand our places. Where do we fit in, and how do we embrace this idea of being a sage? And if we're a sage, then, we need to be passing on wisdom.
I think it's a great point of what are we learning? That was the first thing Tom Brokaw said is when I asked him about grandparenting. He says, so I asked him, what do you teach your grandkids? And he said, I always tell people I've learned more from them than they've learned from me. But I think about our own progression is, and I've heard this from a number of people, that, you just should never stop learning and never stop learning better, find out new things. And the more we learn, the more we can be the sage. And to John Cleese's point, never assume that we know, never have total certainty that we know, but I think to be the seekers of truth and to I think invite our kids and grandkids on that journey with us and share what we know along the way. I hear myself talk about this, and I don't want to sound like public radio and like a know-it-all, because honestly, half the time I get together with grandkids and all I do is tickle them. It's not like I'm sitting around quoting philosophy to the 5-year-olds and 9-year-olds. They call me the tickle monster because I'm apparently quite terrifying and delightful in that regard. So I think there's something to be said for just having fun, right? I mean, it's just,
Oh, sure. Sure. And that's the, I didn't want to think, hey, as soon as you have a grandkid, you got to put on the white robes and get a staff and a wizard's hat or something, something like that. Because one of the great conversations I had was with a 3-star Air Force general that was telling me that when his granddaughter wants to get down and play dolls and have a tea party, by golly, he's getting down on the ground and having a tea party. And to me, that was okay. If a 3-star general who's worked his entire life to have a certain presence and have a certain bit of seriousness and everything else can then put that aside and go, okay, grandpa's getting down on the ground and we're playing Barbies. And then with his other grandson, maybe it's Hot Wheels or whatever it is. Okay, that is part of being that grandfather. And some of this other stuff comes later.
yeah. Anyone I've ever talked with in the military, like once they know the mission, like they go after achieving the mission. And I'm guessing that 3-star general is like being that presence for that little girl, that's a mission, he's living it. So the types of missions never stop and they never stop coming. And for your grandfather or grandmother, it's like it just kind of happens, and all of a sudden there it is. It's like, all right, let's play Barbie.
Yep. Yep. Ted, I wanted to ask you as we start to wrap things up is how can the listeners help you out with this effort? I think you posed a couple of questions in terms of, hey, who should I be talking to? But what could people that are listening to our conversation do to help you?
Along the journey for the book, I'm, actively, have the biggest ears I can to seek out interesting stories that grandfathers have, and not just the stories that are, about the happiness and joy, but the challenges, the hardships, people from different cultures, grandfathers who maybe even, not by choice, are full-time caregivers because their kids have had challenges. Like there's a lot of grandparents, sometimes the kids have had run-ins with the law or drugs, and boom, they're the full-time caregivers. I want to talk to them. I want to seek out people from cultures different from my own. I happen to be a 64-year-old, white male who, for better or worse, my ancestors, old Boston family, not Brahmins, but, I'm just direct descendant of Miles Standish. I'm one particular kind of grandpa, and I don't have the answers. I have some of my own. I want to talk to, just explore, talk to folks who are African American and Hispanic and Jewish and from different all walks of life, and to travel to other countries, the Middle East and South America and different parts of the United States, and explore and listen and learn. So it's there is a way to contact me on my blog, goodgrandpa.com. And I'm shouting my email from the rooftops. It's ted@goodgrandpa.com. Like, reach out to me, because they sometimes people think, well, writers, they sit at a desk and they just write. And there is a lot of time where I'm alone writing, because you can only have one pair of hands on a keyboard. But this is not a solo endeavor. This is not just me. I'm one guy. I'm not famous. I'm not well known. But I just got this mission. I just got this bug in my head and I can't get it out. I've got to learn about this. But that it's going to take all of us. It's going to take people, let's have a conversation, and I would just love to hear from people and just hear different stories, talk to veterans, Vietnam veterans, who've been through a lot. And how does this experience of grandfatherhood change you? Like, what's life like now? What is the number one thing? I want to hear what people say. What's the number one piece of wisdom that you think will make a difference for that next generation? And and just, compile this and, put a picture together for people so that, today's kids and our grandkids have more access to this wisdom, because the wisdom's out there. But, a lot of older people, nobody listens to them. Nobody listens to us, not necessarily me. I'm, it's relative young and at 64, but a lot of folks, you get into your 70s and 80s and you're set aside in the United States. I don't know if it's exactly the same in other cultures, but it's not a coincidence that these influencers on Instagram, there's young, beautiful people in their 20s and they're selling luxury handbags. And I would love it if the real influencers were 85. John Cleese is 84.
Mm.
He's still performing. Tom Brokaw is 82. But these people they've just learned a lot, They learned so much more than me. They should be the influencers, don't you think?
Oh, I do. Yeah, for sure. I mean, you can't beat experience. And the other thing too, to your point, like 20-year-olds hawking, $8,000 handbags. How many 20-year-olds realistically can afford that handbag versus, if you listen to somebody that's in their 70s or 80s that have been there, done that, and they're sharing a little bit of wisdom on how to live, how to build connections, how to do these things that really last, that, nobody can take it away from you. It's not going to go out of fashion. How much more important is that versus, how many inside pockets are in a handbag?
Yeah, it reminds me of a story I heard about. I think it was Joseph Heller and Norman Mailer were at a party. So, famous novelists, Heller wrote Catch-22 and Mailer wrote all kinds of bestsellers, but they were at some New York cocktail party, full of incredibly rich people. And I don't know if it was Heller said this to Mailer or vice versa. He says the difference between us and them is that we know we have enough, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they were old men at the time when they said this. But you don't necessarily have to have that luxury handbag. You don't need you don't need a luxury car necessarily. I had a for much of my 50s, I had an Audi coupe, a black Audi coupe that not that I would do this, but you could go 95 miles per hour, and it felt like you were going 60. And my wife had a Subaru Forester, and every time it was like freezing weather here in New England, half the time the door would freeze on my Audi because of the way it was constructed. So I couldn't close my door.
Mm.
I ended up borrowing my wife's Subaru Forester. It kept getting worse and worse. It's like, hey, can I borrow finally I said, what am I doing here? Is this some kind of dumb midlife crisis? Like trying to prove something that with a fast Audi? And for the past 5 years, what car I've had? I had a Subaru Forester. You have two Subaru Foresters, and if you have a Subaru Forester with snow tires in the state of Vermont, it's like having a snowmobile. You can go through Franconia Notch and all these places in the mountains, and you don't worry about it. Like that to me is luxury, And maybe I had to get into my 60s before I could kind of jettison, other people's perceptions. Like, am I a lesser person because I drive a less expensive car? I don't think so. I'm just not getting stuck any better.
Right. Well, Ted, I've had you on for a while. I'm going to put those links and your email into the show notes. So if anybody's out driving around or walking the dog or whatnot, they can certainly come to the show notes and find those things. Is there any other ways you want people to reach out to you? Any kind of social media contacts that you want people to maybe find you on?
I'm findable on Instagram. Good Grandpa Blog on Instagram. but easily findable. Like if someone just, even if they don't remember the name of the Good Grandpa blog, if they just Google my name and grandfathering, they'll find the New York Times article, the same one that you were in. They'll find the blog, or even if they just Google the blog for grandfathers, Good Grandpa will come up at the top of the search engine. So, but I would encourage not just grandfathers, but grandmothers to, to participate in the conversation. I always love it when people read a story and then comment on it and share their own ideas. And because it's, as I said, it's not a solo activity. It's fun when you just start doing things and then other people sort of get involved and all of a sudden it's a party. And but it's the best parties have good conversations, and I'm trying to make this happen not just here in the U.S. but around the world. There are readers of the blog in China and England and throughout Europe. And I'd love to see more. I'd love to see more people, coming and throwing ideas in and commenting. That would be awesome.
Okay.
But thank you so much, Greg. I really appreciate it, and I'm glad you're getting lots of folks listening to your podcast. I think there was a long time where you and I were the only sort of grandfather voices out there. I hope that we get more over time. But I applaud what you're doing. I think it's great.
Well, thank you so much, and I really appreciated you having you on tonight, Ted.
All right, Greg. Thanks a lot, and we'll see you. We'll see you on the grandpa journey.
I really appreciate Ted's insight about being a good grandpa, and I also enjoyed talking to him about the lessons that he's already learning and sharing on his blog from the likes of Tom Brokaw and John Cleese. It's great when you can talk with people that have maybe a different life experience, a different perspective than maybe what you and I have. The other thing I enjoyed hearing is how he's really looking to travel around the world, talk to people in different cultures, different economic backgrounds, and really understand what does it mean in their lives, in their experience, to be a good grandpa. So I hope if you know a good grandpa, if you know people that you feel would have a great insight and help Ted on his project, that you reach out to him at goodgrandpa.com and then send him an email. Get connected with him. Ted's a great guy, and I know that you would enjoy meeting with him and talking to him about being a good grandpa. So if you've enjoyed this conversation, do me a favor, share it with 3 people that would enjoy listening to Ted's insightful questions and his answers. And as we both just sit back and go through and explore what being a good grandpa and a cool grandpa is all about. So help me out. Share this with friends and neighbors. Leave me a nice review on whatever platform you're listening to this podcast. And until next time, remember to stay cool. Thank you for listening to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do me a favor and share it with a friend. That's the best way you can help us to expand our community, as well as get the news out about how valuable grandpas are in the lives of those kids. If you'd like to leave me a comment or shoot me a potential topic for this podcast, please go to www.cool-grandpa.us. Look for the comments tab, fill it out, hit submit. It's as easy as that. Until next time, remember to stay cool.